If we inspect our security context.xml file, you'll notice that for our authentication provider, we are using an in-memory user service. This approach is not very dynamic because we really can't expand upon the amount of users within the system. So in this lesson, we're going to create our own custom user details service, which will be a little bit more robust. So the first thing that we'll do is we will remove the user service within our authentication provider. Now, by default, our authentication provider is a DAO authentication provider. Basically, this means that it looks at a username and a password and compares it to what is returned by the user service. So the user will enter an authentication object which contains a username and password. The authentication provider, which is the DAO authentication provider, will then pass that username off to a user service, which will then return the information for that particular user. A comparison is then made between the credentials provided by the user service and the authentication object's credentials to determine if the user is indeed valid. So we'll take out that user service, and now we can specify on our authentication provider tag a user service ref. So this should point to a bean that implements the user details service interface. Now, currently we do not have that class, so we are going to create it. So within our package explorer, I'm going to go to the com.o'reilly.security package and simply hit Control-N to pull up the new dialog, and then I'll create a new class. I'm going to call my new class Custom User Details Service. I'm going to implement the User Details Service interface. So I'll pull that interface up and then simply hit OK. And now I can finish and our class will be created. So we have this one method on the User Details Service interface that we must provide an implementation for, and that's the load user by username method. So the way we're going to approach this is first we're going to make this a bean. So I will add the component annotation, and I'm going to provide a name of custom user details service, and I'll copy that. We'll import our component annotation. Since we are working with a bean, we're going to auto-wire the auto user repository so that we can query our database for auto users. So I'm going to add a private auto user repository object, and I'll just call that repo, and we'll import the auto-wired annotation. We need to perform some component scanning so that we pick up this component annotation. We will first open our pom.xml file because we need to include the context namespace to perform component scanning. So we're going to go out and we're going to look for the dependency Spring context support, and we'll pull in that dependency. And I'm going to make the version match all of the other Spring components I have. So it's going to be 4.1.7. I'm pulling from the org.spring framework group ID, and I'll save that, and we can now close our pom.xml file. And then this allows us to enable the namespace within our security context.xml file. So there we have the context namespace. We can go in, and now we can component scan using the context namespace. And I want to scan com.o'reilly.security. And that's going to cause Spring to look for beans within that package, which means it's going to pick up our custom user detail service. This is all basic Spring core, as I mentioned before. Then it can then auto-wire the user repository. We need to first consult the repository and pull out a auto user by the username. Currently, if we look at our repository, we do not have that method, but we can easily create one because we're using Spring Data. So public auto user, find by username, provide a string username, and that's going to do all that plumbing for us very quickly. So now we can use that method, we can invoke it, and pass in the username being provided by the load user by username method as a parameter. Now we have our user, we've pulled them from the database. All we need to do now is return a user details object to Spring Security. The user class within Spring implements the user details interface. So if we pull in the org.springframework.security.core.userdetails.user class, we can then create a new instance of user details. And here, what we do is we pass in the username, password, and then finally we pass in any roles into an authorityutils.createAuthority list. Now we get the user and we get their roles. And at this point, we have created our new user details object. So what Spring Security will do now, it's going to compare what the users passed in to this information that we pulled back from our database. So if the password doesn't match what the user provided, it's not going to authenticate them and allow them to access a particular resource. There's one last thing we need to do. You remember that we haven't provided our bean name yet, so we're going to copy the bean name custom user details service, and we'll navigate over to the securitycontext.xml file. And now we will provide our bean name for our user service ref attribute. And it's going to point to that user service that we have defined and that will become a bean via Spring's component scanning. You can look in the init SQL file, and here you see we have created a number of users, and we have stored them within our database. So I'm going to log in as Junior Doe, so JRDOE, and then the password is password. I can quickly restart my Tomcat server, and now we can navigate over to the application. We can now attempt to log in with Junior Doe's credentials, which are stored in our database and accessed via our user details service. And there you see we're able to log in with a user whose credentials are stored in our database. So this was a look at the user details service within Spring Security.